Welcome to Think Orphan, the podcast for orphan excellence. Real talk with real people navigating the global orphan crisis.
Welcome back to the Think Orphan podcast. Thanks again for being a part of the conversation. Thank you for really engaging it, not just listening and doing nothing with it, but actually taking this stuff and using it to help lives to flourish and help those around you to really live out their gifts and talents. So I'm Phil Dark, your host, and with me, as usual, is my brother, Brandon Stiver. Brandon, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I'm super pumped for this interview today. Also pumped for those that are listening. This will be releasing in September, which means we will just be, a week and a half away from CAFO Summit in Oklahoma City. So shout out to those people that are going to be joining us in Oklahoma City. Phil, you're going to be there. I'm going to be there.
Yep.
We're actually a part of the same intensive, right? Moving towards family-based solutions, which is going to be right before CAFO Summit. So that's cool. Should be fun. Should be exciting. You doing anything else while you're out there in OKC?
I do hope everyone, stops by, say hi, reach out, let us know you're going to be there. See if we can, at least say hi. If not, grab coffee together and meet and connect and see what you're doing, see how we might be able to work together. I will be doing, I'll be there Tuesday to Friday. So I'm around. I got a couple meetings already set. Excited for those. I'm actually on Monday going to be heading out. A good friend of mine, his son, is now a freshman at the University of Oklahoma, preferred walk-on with the football team. So going to go visit him, probably take him to dinner on Monday. And, I'm hoping he gives me a little tour of the facility. So if you're listening, Ty, I doubt you are, but if you are, know that would be really cool. So that would be a good fun time. So who knows? It'll be cool. I've never been to Oklahoma, so I can cross that off the states that I have now visited, and definitely never been to Norman and seeing the big OU. So it'll be interesting. All right. It'll be a good time. But who do we have today? More importantly, who do we have today? Right. Because this is a great interview. I'm
a great interview.
Stoked to get this out to everybody.
Yeah, great conversations ahead. Both at CAFO Summit and on our interview today. So today we have Brian Fikkert on the show, a man who probably needs no introduction. He wrote When Helping Hurts. He's written Becoming Whole. He's written just phenomenal books and such a thought leader in this space. But we also have a bonus. We also have Gabriel Walder from Alliance for Children Everywhere joining as well. A great organization doing really important work in Zambia, and they just recently incorporated in Malawi as well. And just a great organization, a great leader in terms of providing care in the global South. And we get to talk through collaboration. We get to talk through work that they've done together, kind of bringing together the best in economic development with great practice in orphan care and family-based care. So this is a fun conversation. I know, our listeners are going to get a lot out of it. So, let's get into this conversation that we were able to have with Brian and Gabe.
Well, Brian and Gabe, it is so great to have you here on Think Orphan. Brian, again, Gabe, this is the first time, right? Yeah?
It is the first time.
I feel like we've had such great conversations. I can never remember if we've actually had you on. I know we had Kari on before to talk about ACE and the great work you're doing, but that was a while back. So what we want to do now, as usual, we usually have you share your story because people don't know who you are. I know that Brian, you've been on, but Brian, I'd love to hear from you, just what you've been up to, what Chalmers has been up to. Since I think it was a while back. Brandon, you probably know the exact date.
I don't know the exact date, but it was 2018 last time we had Carrie on, and the last time we had Brian on. So, and I did listen to Brian's not too long ago, and it was just fantastic. So
you basically set the bar really high, is what you're doing there, Brandon. But that's all right. We're good. We'll take care of it. We'll hit it. We'll hit it and exceed it. But Brian, just what's been going on since 2018? Tons of stuff. Just a snapshot, some of the cool stuff, some of the highlights that have happened, additional books. We've probably written like 30 books since then, but just a few touch points of these are the highlights. And I know this little thing called COVID happened in between there, but we won't highlight that unless some cool things happen during it. So just give us a little update.
Thing is that my son and his wife had twin girls.
Nice.
So I was the father of twin.
Wow.
Girls, and they own me. So pretty much my entire world gets reduced down to just looking at them and holding them and playing with them when I'm with them. So that's the most important thing. But
can we get a picture of that to put in the show notes? Because I want to see the 6'10" Brian Fikkert holding a little baby in his arms, or two at the same time, and see how little they look, even more little. So if we can do that, that'd be fantastic. That'd be
a lot of fun. So on the personal side, that's the big story. On the work side, this has been a difficult time for everybody, for every ministry and so on. And so certainly we've gone through ups and downs and continue to, but we also see God working to move us into a particular direction, we think. And so historically, the Chalmers Center has said that we are a church equipping organization. We want to help people who are poor to see the local church in their community as what the Bible says it is, the very embodiment of Jesus Christ. And so towards that end, we have designed strategies and initiatives that we think the local church can use. We field tested those strategies, then we've trained churches and church equipping organizations to use those strategies and to scale them beyond us. And so we've historically had a focus on some core ideas about poverty. So some of that's captured in our book, When Helping Hurts. But then we've also had particular expertise in the sector of economic development, helping people to be able to work, support themselves through that work, glorify God in the process. And so in that arena, we've been very active in the U.S. side on jobs preparedness training, helping people get off of welfare and into work, financial literacy, helping them understand how to steward their money better. Then internationally, we focused very much in the space of microfinance and microenterprise development. And so that's all been going on. That continues to go on. We continue to be very excited about all of that. But in the last 5 years or so, we started to realize that it seems like God has dragged us into understanding his theory of change, if you will, or his story of change even more deeply. And so I've co-authored 2 books with Kelly, who's a theologian. One of them is called Becoming Whole, Why the Opposite of Poverty Isn't the American Dream. And then the Field Guide to Becoming Whole. And basically what we're trying to do there is to just communicate, what is God's story of change? What are God's goals? And you might rephrase that as, what does human flourishing really look like? Then how does God typically go about achieving those goals? And so there's that piece. And then what we've really said is, there's a sense in which Christians are asked to live into a world that's not yet fully here yet. We are called to embody Christ's kingdom, but that kingdom isn't fully here, and nobody quite knows what it looks like in this village or in this city or or in my neighborhood here. And so we have to improvise the kingdom to some degree. And so what we've done is we've taken some of the core ideas in Becoming Whole and the Field Guide. We've integrated that with tools from the field of design thinking, tools for creativity and imagination. And now we have a series of products that we're calling Innovate, in which we're helping ministries to really creatively improvise God's story in their particular setting. And a lot of it, quite frankly, is helping God's people to rediscover who we really are. I don't think we really know we don't know God's story that well. We don't know who we are in that story. And so it's helping the church to rediscover God's story, to understand who we are, and then to creatively live into that. And so God has been blessing that. And increasingly, we see Chalmers, God is, I think, using us to impact, I would say, the paradigms and practices of the Christian ecosystem. So we still want to maintain our emphasis in the local church because we think that's central to God's story, but increasingly we're finding ourselves in the space of speaking into the philanthropic space, the business community, academia, various sectors. And so still very focused in the local church, but starting to see God use us to change the paradigms and practices more broadly. So that's what we're doing. And we've loved working with Gabe. We tried to hire Gabe at one point, but he's like the prophet's son, off in the wrong direction, and eventually he will come home.
Yeah.
Welcome him with open arms. We will slaughter the fatted calf for Gabe, but
That's
we've been
awesome.
working with Gabe and with his organization, ACE, and trying to creatively work in the space of orphans and vulnerable children.
Yeah, I love that. I remember getting on a phone call with you about a decade ago. Peter Greer had connected us, and we were talking about doing the forward to In Pursuit of Orphan Excellence. And actually, it was even before that phone call. I was at a CAFO summit, and I said something to you. We talked, and I said, I'd love to, have you do the forward. And the question was, well, I don't know how much When Helping Hearst has to do with orphan care. And then I was like, this is fantastic to see what God has done. And I think that goes to what you said. We are trying to find God's theory of change. We're trying to find his. We hear so many people, let's find, what is our theory of change? What is our theory of change? What is our theory of change? It flips it on its head and says, no, what is God's theory of change? How can we live into that? And to open. And I've seen that in you in so many different ways. You've been so encouraging to me in so many different ways. And I love it. So just thank you for being faithful to the call and seeking God's theory of change personally and corporately. It's so evident. So evident.
God's used you in my life. And this is just a learning journey we're all on.
Love it.
It's the more we interact with each other, you start to hear things that overlap and are synergies, and I think I see something there. And so it's really a precious thing that God is doing in our lives.
100%. All right, Gabe, your turn. Just you're new to the Think Orphan audience. Some people probably know you, the flowing locks. It's just, something that you have, that kind of Thor look
Samson
about you that comes. And but there's so much more to you than that. And I just love for you to just share just your story a little bit and tell us what's going on with ACE since we last talked to Kari a few years ago.
Sure. Yeah. So, I've been in this position now. I can't believe it, but it's been a little over 4 years. So it's going quickly and slowly at the same time. As Brian said, it's been a difficult season for a lot of organizations, and especially during COVID, just the ups and downs of not knowing what programming you could implement, not knowing what philanthropy would look like, all of that. But for me personally, it's been a long journey. So I actually, probably the introduction to the OVC space started when I studied abroad in Dakar, Senegal. And there were these street children that would interact with us at the West African Research Center. They would come up and they would ask for food and they would ask for money. And I knew enough, even as an undergrad, that it wasn't as simple as just handing out food or money. But it really broke me, to be honest with you. Just seeing the reality of these kids coming up, seeing the reality of the brokenness of just the acute poverty in Senegal. And also as an undergrad, realizing that there was no simple solution, right? There was no silver bullet. There was no obvious answer. And each individual child was a soul that God had created and a human that God had created and had complexities. And also there was no easy solution, as they were all individual image bearers of God. So when I got back from studying abroad, my wife and I, as a large part, a result of that experience, decided to become foster parents. So we started fostering, and that was, an entire experience in and of itself. So we fostered for about 5 years. We had 2 long-term placements that did not result in adoption. Both of those placements were incredibly difficult for us. We obviously loved them and supported them, and even beyond that, really wanted for the reunification to take place and wanted to support the local families, wanted to support the biological families of those children. But we also saw, again, that it was complex and it was difficult. So for me, when I started fostering and I had just gotten done with my undergrad, I ended up doing my master's in international development, but I was in Central Illinois kind of thinking, okay, what am I going to do with a master's in international development in Central Illinois? And so I actually got introduced to an organization called Loving Shepherd Ministries, worked there in Haiti for about 4 years, and then worked for All God's Children International before coming on with ACE as the executive director and CEO for the last 4 years. But the big personal thing would be that we have 4 children, and 2 of which are adopted. Actually, my youngest just turned 2 a couple days ago, which was really exciting, and they're all doing really well. But in terms of ACE, ACE has actually been around for 52 years, so a really long, rich history. This year, 2023, is the 25th anniversary of ACE Zambia. So ACE Zambia, primarily in Lusaka, has been operating primarily as a community-based organization, a CBO, for the last 25 years. That means that we have a local staff of about 75 local Zambians, and we also have a local board of directors as well that ACE USA kind of works with directly and indirectly. So what I would say the big shift for ACE has been, we're just in the last 3 years moving away from just direct implementation through ACE Zambia and now ACE Malawi, but also through ACE Transition Partners. So that really is tied also to the economic development work that we've done with the Chalmers Center and with Brian in particular, because we've realized that although we focus primarily on reunifications and foster to adopt, the economic strengthening and the acute poverty that these families experience was, for the most part, one of the main drivers for that family separation. So ACE Transition Partners is now working in about 6 different countries with about 8 different clients. And really the theory of change and what we feel like God has called us to is, how do we take that 25 years and then really 52 years of experience and help other organizations in their own journey transitioning primarily from institutional care or running orphanages to family-based care. And again, just like every individual child is unique, every organization is unique. So we know that there has to be a lot of both caution and wisdom when you're working with an organization to make sure that you're customizing your services to a certain extent to make sure that you're in the context that they're actually working in. Like Brian alluded to earlier, it's not as simple as saying, hey, this has worked in Zambia for the last 25 years. It should work in this particular setting in Malawi. Every village is different. Every city is different. Every country is different. Every region's different. And so I think the ethos of ACE Transition Partners and what I think God's really called us to is, we don't pretend to have all of the solutions, and we never will. We are just saying, hey, God has blessed us enough that we have a long history of and a long track record of success with family-based care. And I think, frankly, to be honest, there's just not enough collaboration in our sector. There never has been. And I think that a lot of people, especially when things are going well, tend to maybe hoard those solutions. And so for us, we're saying we want to be open-handed. Obviously, there's wisdom in that too, open-handed, and just allowing organizations to walk that journey that we feel like God really does intend for children to be with families. And there's a biblical mandate for that as well. So,
no, it's so good, Gabe. And just, I love what you say there in terms of, walking alongside organizations. I love that idea. And we recently had a conversation around orphanage transformation and walking alongside with other organizations that are operating in the same space. I would love for our listeners to look back at that conversation we had a month ago and just really appreciate the work that ACE is doing and ACE Transition Partners. Guys, we want to jump in, and I'm going to come to you, Brian. As I was listening to your last episode, which was 5 years ago, and kind of thinking about, okay, you have this great partnership with ACE, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But as Phil has mentioned before, When Helping Hurts is kind of the go-to recommendation on this podcast. And it has just spoken so much. The last episode that we recorded, which will actually be in front of this one, was actually looking at abuse in orphanages and child protection. And even in that scenario, one of our people talking about, the propensity for poor practice, from Westerners going into these spaces. She had your book on hand. She actually had 2 of your books on hand. And she said, I have Brian Fikkert here just in case I need him, And I said, well, your episode will come right after his. But at any rate, when we talk about this, international community development, economic development, cross-cultural stuff, and we are talking about, orphan care, child welfare, one of the things that we often kind of speak to in child welfare is service provision or family support. These are very kind of common, ubiquitous words that we use. And there's kind of this whole history you even mentioned a moment ago as far as like helping people get off of welfare, right? So there's kind of a whole history of like, what does it mean for people to be perpetually on welfare, right? And yet we say this is the child welfare space. So this kind of word of welfare can almost have a negative connotation. It can potentially be a disempowering position. I would just kind of be curious, as you have from the economic development and the community development space, interacting with child welfare or just with vulnerable families in this way. I'm curious from your experience and mission to the poor, if you could maybe even provide a critique almost of the approach that we go to and help us kind of discern that line between child welfare, providing services. Maybe this is kind of like relief versus supporting people to progress, in their families and living situations, maybe something more akin to development, as you talk about when helping hurts.
Yeah. Whatever you're all paying me to do this, you're not paying me enough for this moment. It's like paying me anything. So,
I'll be honest, Brian, when even some of my staff, I was like, yeah, Brian Fickert's going to come back on the show. And they're like, I love Brian Fikkert. Okay. So I had to think of what's the best question that I could just pin this guy to the wall, So anyways.
Well, and I always say we get what we pay for. So,
that's right.
That's
there you go.
Exactly right.
Disclaimer, we don't pay anybody to come on Think Orphan. Okay, go ahead.
Never will. No, anyway. Okay.
There's so many things to unpack there. So let me start with the most superficial piece, just a very, very, very superficial thing. The American church right now is so divided and so many issues. And one of the things that we're divided on is, are people poor because of their individual sin or because of some kind of systemic injustice? And there's some overlap between that division and the question you're asking me. So those who think that it's about individual brokenness tend to be opposed to any kind of government intervention at all. The problem is inside, it's the soul. We've got to fix the soul, and government handouts won't fix that. And then others who are more into structural injustice would say, no, the systems are broken. That's what's going on. We've got to address those. And to be honest with you, well, by the way, my primary spiritual gift is offensiveness. So here we go. The fall happened. The fall happened. And it's because the fall happened, because the fall is comprehensive in scope, of course individuals are broken. And of course systems are broken. And oh, by the way, demonic forces have been given greater latitude post-Genesis 3 as well. And so this entire division, now I don't know I'm probably stepping on everybody's toes, it's just silly. Of course individuals are broken. Of course systems are broken. And there's demonic forces. So we all just kind of need to go over ourselves a little bit. So that's just the preamble. I would say that another slice at what you're asking me, we could take it from this perspective. My view is that the vast majority of poverty alleviation efforts have flown out of a story of Western naturalism, which says that the human being is fundamentally a physical creature. And so happiness comes from consuming more stuff. So how can people consume more stuff? Well, you can either give them things, that's the traditional welfare system, or you can help them earn more so they can buy more things. That's more the economic empowerment strategy. My suspicion is that many people listening to this podcast today prefer the economic empowerment strategy. Let's help strengthen families economically. If we strengthen them economically, they can be better places to raise children. We can prevent orphans, and we can prevent people from becoming orphans to begin with. We can help vulnerable children. Let's economically strengthen the family. And I certainly agree with that. And a lot of our work with ACE is in that space. But I think we have to be careful with the economic empowerment strategy as well. You may have noticed America's not doing that great. Our families, our families are falling apart. Our communities are falling apart. The political process is broken. We're coming apart at the seams. But we've got economic empowerment. We're the greatest economic success story the world has ever seen, and yet we're miserable. And so economic empowerment on its own is a false story. We're not just created to be consuming machines who pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps so we can earn more to consume more. That's not who we are as God's creatures. And so we think about strengthening the family. I think we have to ask, strengthening them for what? Is it for more of the American dream of highly individualistic, materialistic consumerism? Or is it strengthening the family to be a greenhouse that produces image bearers? And central to image bearing is that we're hardwired for relationship with God, self, others, and creation. And that relationship with creation is one of work, not just to get more stuff, but work as worship to God and as service to others. And so it's a different story that requires different design of our interventions, quite frankly, different operations, different funding sources, different metrics. It's a different story. And so that's a lot, but it's a different thing. We've got to live into the right story.
Hey everyone, I wanted to tell you about one of my favorite conferences, which is coming up this October. It's the Replanted Conference, and if you are a foster parent, an adoptive parent, a safe family parent, or if you are involved as a support to these kinds of families, Replanted is the conference for you. The Replanted Conference will be held October 12th through 14th, 2023 in Chicago. But if you aren't able to make it to Chicago, don't worry. They've got simulcast sites in cities throughout the country. I was a part of one of the simulcast sites last year, and as an adoptive dad, I walked away refreshed, equipped, and inspired for this caregiving journey. I know you will be too. The highly specialized training, the stories from adult adoptees and foster alumni, and the invaluable community support will blow your mind. Not only that, but as a listener of Think Orphan, you get a special discount by using the coupon code 1MH10. That is $10 off with the code 1MH10. Guys, you don't want to miss this conference. Tell a friend and visit replantedconference.org to secure your spot today. And I think what I hear you saying is, look, there's complexity here. There's nuance, of course, and different families, different organizations are going to fill different needs or need different needs, right? So I definitely hear that, and of course it makes me wonder, how can we, okay, so going to the international development space, we look at something like, okay, you can look at gross national income per capita or GDP, some of these kind of economic markers, but then you have the Human Development Index, right? Which is, okay, you gave a thumbs up for the HDI because it's going in the right direction. Because, so for those that don't know, it not only looks at GDP, but it also looks at life expectancy and literacy education, and it kind of brings those things together to try to create some sort of proxy for human flourishing. Now, human flourishing is kind of a Christian word that we use quite a bit. So hopefully, we can move countries, communities more up the HDI. But
there's a whole movement towards more holistic measures. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate, those efforts. Of course, when anybody listens to a podcast, especially with such brilliant minds as the two of you, we want to find the silver bullet. And those silver bullets simply do not exist, including not even for the families that we're serving. But prayerfully, hopefully, we can see families move forward. I want to...
Hey, Brandon, on that note, I just want to add, since episode 1, I think that if you want one common thread from every episode we've ever had, it's that. There is no silver bullet. It's nuanced. We need to work together. We need to value and respect each other. We need to listen to each other. We need to understand each other and not come in with our way is the right way. You need to do what we do, and we can tack in a couple of your cute little things, but we do it the right way. Those are the people that tend to come in, flash in the pan, get out. The people that stick around are the people that understand we don't know everything. We never will know everything. With every answer comes 50 more questions, and that's why we need each other. And so that's why I love this episode, having you two working together, people who have been doing things in different areas, and neither come into the table with, I got the answers, so you can work with me. No, it's we need to work together to glean from each other. And it's absolutely, it'd be very easy for you, Brian, to sit on your laurels and say, I wrote a book that was sold a ton of copies, and you are probably one of the most humble guys I've ever worked with on it. And that's where it's something that is, and I know, that's something that is because God has empowered that and enabled that. So I just wanted to say that there, because I know you kind of said it as a joke a little bit, Brandon, but I think it's so important to not only remember there's nuances and there's no silver bullet, but also remember we're not searching for the silver bullet, because there isn't one and there never will be one. And that's something that is critical as we have this conversation.
Right. And we can just put that as the tagline for Think Orphan. Think Orphan. No silver bullets here. Keep on moving. One of the things though that you mentioned there, Phil, is in terms of collaboration, and collaboration is something that creates those nuanced solutions. There are things that Chalmers brings in. There are things that ACE brings in. And when there's a collaboration there, or even 1 Million Home in Providence World, right? One of the coming together around this podcast and equipping people throughout the world to better care for orphans. There are things that are created when we can collaborate, and we'll kind of, by having two different executives from two different organizations, that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this particular conversation. I do want to point our listeners to an article that the two of you wrote along with Jack Eanes on church leaders. We will have it linked in the show notes. It's called When Helping Hurts Vulnerable Children. And it was a good read. I kind of wanted to pull a quote from this article that you guys wrote together. In the article you write, as described in the book When Helping Hurts, effective and sustainable poverty alleviation doesn't start with bringing in lots of outside money. Rather, it begins with an asset-based approach, identifying local resources that can be used to solve local problems. In this situation, an asset-based approach reveals that the most essential asset for child rearing is already present in the most impoverished settings, families. I love that. I wholeheartedly agree. I want to hear from Gabe. Gabriel, as you guys have, walked alongside Chalmers, you've obviously followed Brian's work and have been collaborating now for some time. Could you just kind of speak to how the principles of When Helping Hurts applies to the work of ACE, of Alliance for Children Everywhere? And, even how does your team view families as assets, as kind of those core assets to raising a child?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is this concept of material poverty versus poverty just in general, right? So a lot of times you hear people say someone's impoverished or they have, they're in poverty. And I think one of the key terms that really came to me out of When Helping Hurts was the idea of just material poverty as opposed to poverty in general. The reality is the families that we work with, they're not impoverished in spirit. They're not impoverished in community. They're not impoverished in just their sense of belonging even together. But they are simply lacking resources, material resources. And so for us, we had been doing something called just savings groups, village savings and loan, which worked well, but we realized kind of early on that there was some dependency on what we were doing with emergency food distribution as well. That was a part of that savings group kind of cohort. So when I had kind of thought through When Helping Hurts and reread it for probably the 5th time, I realized, hey, we're doing something really effective here, especially with savings groups, but this emergency food distribution is creating some long-term dependency. So we would have families that would kind of roll off of it, and then within 6 months, they would be coming back and saying, hey, we need to re-enter into the program. And so we had heard and read about the graduation approach And that really is more of a 6-pronged asset transfer, business development, skills training, market literacy. There's, all these aspects to it. And I realized that the core behind it was it's finite, right? So it only lasts 18 to 24 months. And then the families are intended to, quote, graduate from the program, and then they can be sustained long term. I think what I really love about that is that, like you mentioned, Brandon, and to Brian's book, is these families have the assets that they need for the large part to be sustainably out of poverty. It was just that we needed to basically get them over the hump in some cases with resources and injecting some capital into that. But for us, I think what's really been incredible is seeing the transformation that these families go through the graduation approach. So a lot of times you'll see that these families, once they graduate from the GA, they actually then in turn start employing other individuals and other community members within the business that they started. And that's an incredible testimony, because they went from acute poverty, less than $1 a day in some cases, to now literally entrepreneurs that are employing, in some cases, 5 to 10 individuals in their small business that they're running,
Wow.
which for us is not something that ACE takes credit for. It's really the credit goes to these families. It goes to God working in their hearts. And also, we're now introducing sort of a spiritual lens to the graduation approach. What we've realized is that we target primarily about 95% of the individuals that we work with in the GA are women. And a lot of them are single mothers. And a lot of them have been survivors of domestic abuse and other abusive situations. And so they came through the GA, but they actually voiced on their own, hey, this is great. And it's, addressing a lot of our physical needs, but we also have spiritual and emotional and trauma needs as well. And so one of our employees, Matrita Fury, is now starting kind of a spiritual lens, and it actually takes on a lot of the work that the Chalmers Center has done and some of the principles from When Helping Hurts, where we're able to have kind of a, more importantly, even than the physical components, a spiritual healing that can take place in these families. So these women are not only empowered to employ 5 other women in their entrepreneurship, but they can actually speak to the healing that's happened in their hearts and their minds and their spirits, and that they've come from this traumatic experience and that God has healed them. And then now they can actually speak to these other women about the experiences that they've had that are in a lot of times very similar situations and similar experiences. So I think in total, we really just feel like the family is the solution. We really feel like the family is the asset. And we know, even from the proof of concept that we've done with a small cohort of about 300 families, about 85% of them already, and this has been about a year since they stopped the program, 85% of them are actually out and have graduated from poverty sustainably. And I think when we started, even probably Brian and I can attest to this, we weren't sure that it would be such a high, rate of success. And again, that's not about ACE. That's not about Chalmers. It's not about a silver bullet. It just speaks to all of the assets that were already there, right? And all of the knowledge,
Sure.
all of the community. So,
Yeah, though that's really good, and I appreciate what you said there towards the beginning in terms of like different definitions of what poverty is, right? And of course, if we go to When Helping Hurts or when we go to Walking with the Poor, we are understanding the multiple dimensions of what poverty is, and what we see when kids are becoming separated from their families, especially if poverty is one of those main root causes, right? It tends to be poverty plus something else, right? But poverty leads to those other adversities. But now if the kid is being dropped off at an orphanage, well, now the poverty has actually increased, right? Because now they're at a much higher rate of relational poverty and the strength and the asset of what those relationships entail. So I appreciate that. We need to have just in the same way that we can't understand everything in terms of the well-being of people by just looking at economic numbers, GNI, GDP, but we want to have HDI, those types of things. It's the same when we talk about poverty, right? The poverty isn't just that lack, right? That's kind of the first fallacy, right? Poverty is deficit, right? No, poverty is not just a deficit of material things. Poverty is something that is much more. And of course, we credit Brian and Steve, and of course before them, even Bryant Myers, Jayakumar Christian, and others that really kind of have helped us within the faith understand that multidimensional poverty. Gabe, I would love to even just kind of tack on, talking about that broken relationship piece, right? When Helping Hurts provides an understanding of broken relationships as a cause of poverty, and you guys as a child welfare provider, right? You guys are supporting reunifications, you guys are doing foster care, you guys are having I believe you guys still have a crisis nursery, for kids that have fallen out or have been abandoned. As you guys are understanding, these relationship dynamics of poverty and how that, leads to such poverty, are you seeing this understanding manifest in families that ACE is serving, this understanding broken relationships as a cause of poverty? Are you seeing this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think let's talk about the crisis nurseries, I guess, first. So we do have 2 crisis nurseries. One's called House of Moses. One's called Bill and Betty Bryant Crisis Nursery. And really what we see is a lot of abandonment. We see a lot of children that have been neglected to the point where they actually have police or other neighbors perhaps that notice, similar to the American foster care system, where they're notified, the police come and actually take and separate the child from that family, either biological family or the original caregivers. And I think what is kind of incredible to see, however, is a lot of these families, we can also see a lot of healing that can take place. Reunifications, it's not as simple as just economic strengthening, but it also is the spiritual that I talked about before and the trauma healing. We actually just had 2 of our consultants that run ACE Transition Partners go to Grand Rapids and go through the TBRI practitioner training. And that was incredibly important for us because, again, every one of these families is unique. Like we said, there's no silver bullet, and every situation is incredibly different and complex. And so for us to approach these families with a lot of humility and also putting ourselves in their place, it's really easy to assume, hey, there was an abandonment or there was neglect or there was an abuse. And so we can oftentimes almost criminalize those individuals. And obviously there is the abuse and neglect, all of that is serious. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just saying that poverty also can be a driver for separation as well. And so you can kind of turn that notion on its head a little bit and say, when someone's in acute poverty, it really changes the dynamic of how things are, and it changes how people are interacting with one another as well. And so we also want to be cognizant of that too.
No, that's really good. And when we think about all the issues that are, facing families, and we kind of think about this whole system of what it means to live in a global community, and even for us to kind of be, faith-based providers. So earlier, Gabe, you were talking about how, your guys' own experience within family-based care and then providing support through ACE Transition Partners to other organizations. There's this whole continuum. And one of the things that I want to hear from Brian on is this component around the work of the American church in intercultural types of, environments and working cross-culturally. When you were on the last show 5 years ago, you pointed that churches often might have little incentive to change their mindsets around mission practices because, as you said, the customer is in the pew. All right, so I
spiritual gift you're talking about. So that's
yeah,
good.
that's
good.
Right.
I liked it.
It's the prophetic. It's the prophetic, and I appreciate the honesty of that. I mean, I lived in Tanzania for 8 years. And the way that churches operate there is just quite different. And I'm not trying to say like, oh, it's perfect over there and over here it's terrible. I actually am a part of a congregation that I absolutely love, and they have a heart for the community. They have a heart for the congregation. So it's not one of those, but the way that they function in the global South can be quite different, right? And here, because we do live in this very consumeristic, individualistic, these are some of our kind of broader society markers in the U.S., the customer then is in the pew when we apply that almost ecclesiologically. So this has led to poor practice historically in Christian involvement in orphan care, of course. I would just be kind of interested, if we kind of have that marker of 2018 when you were last talking with Phil about this. I'm wondering if you've seen any kind of shift in that dynamic, as many churches have even shuttered their doors. And, we referred to COVID, church attendance has gone down. Many churches have closed post-pandemic. Have you seen any shift? And then, even maybe speak to the hopeful part as well. What are some opportunities that might be in front of the American church to reorient ourselves?
Wow. The question's going to start to get any easier at some points in this podcast.
I'm gonna let Phil go next. So yes, they'll get much easier.
I'm just gonna tell you, Brandon's the guy that brings a PhD level books and recommendations and stuff, and I like to stick to the coloring book. So, I try to keep it, light and fun and friendly, and Brandon just brings these uppercuts. So I'm just saying, that's why we brought him on. He can bring these things. But you basically have a couple books written on it, too. That's the good news, is you can point people to other things you've written, too.
That's true, which, of course, we'll link. But, Brian, go ahead.
So, first of all, it's become quite popular these days to bash the church, to bash the American church. I'm not too crazy about all that. So I'm highly critical of the church. The church drives me nuts. But it's the body and bride and fullness of Jesus Christ. So I think we ought to tread pretty lightly when we start. Somebody posted on Facebook the other day a quote from Charles Spurgeon. And I'm not going to get it quite right, but he basically says, be careful when you start to get pleasure from bashing the church. And so I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. So I'm very frustrated with the U.S. church, as many are, but she's the bride of Christ, and we're part of her, and we don't get to choose to exit her. So I'm all in on the church.
Yeah, I remember Shane Claiborne said, the church is like Noah's Ark. When you're inside, there's a lot of poop everywhere, but if you jump out, you die. So
that's a great quote. I love that. I would say that the American church, in my view, has been really affected by another false story. And we call this one in our book, Becoming Whole, we call it evangelical Gnosticism. And we get that term from a development thinker named Darrell Miller. And the basic idea in Gnosticism is an ancient heresy, but the basic idea in Gnosticism is that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. And the church has kind of intermingled that a bit with the gospel in the following sense. In the church's anthropology, we tend towards thinking that the body is a container for the soul in the way that a cup contains water. And so you can pour out the water, right? The water and the cup aren't actually intertwined. They touch each other, but they're not intertwined. And so in that story, we tend to think that the real goal is to get the soul to heaven for all eternity. So we focus on that. We don't really have a story for the body. We don't really have a story for this life. So we get out of bed on Monday morning. What do? I've accepted Christ as my Savior. My soul is going to go to heaven and float around like a ghost for all eternity. And that doesn't sound that appealing, quite frankly. But it's better than going the other place. So my soul is floating around like a ghost. I don't have a story for this life. So what we do is we revert to the only story we know, Monday through Saturday, the story of the American dream, which is a highly individualistic, highly materialistic, highly consumer-oriented story. And it doesn't work. We're not flourishing. And the church, in my view, has, rather than trying to give a better story, has borrowed from that story and said, yeah, man, maybe if we had a better band, maybe if we were more entertaining. Well, you know what? Hollywood's better at being Hollywood than we are. And so it's just not working. And so so it's a mess. And so my view is what happened in COVID is we all got really lonely because we're all really isolated. And everybody's going, man, being alone isn't that great. I really want relationships with people. But a lot of us have kind of decided that the world is better at relationships than the church is. And so we're not going back. And so I think the opportunity here for the church is to really give a better story and to live into a better story. And that means telling the story, but it means practicing the story. It's about community. It's about relationship. And by the way, I stink at everything I'm talking about. I'm horrible at all of this. The Chalmers staff call me Dr. Relationship because I'm talking about it all day long. I'm all theory, man. I've got to go somewhere this afternoon at 4:30, and I don't feel like going. I want to be left alone. I'm at home right now. My pergola is out there calling my name. I just want to go sit there and be left alone. And I got to go do something community related this afternoon. I don't feel like it. I stink at this. I have to develop better muscles. I've got to develop better habits, better patterns, because left alone, I'm not that great. I need others. And so I think the church has a real opportunity in a culture that is spiraling out of control to be different, to be the people of God, to be that kingdom community that offers real, authentic relationship, where it's okay to be broken, where it's okay to say, I don't have this figured out, where it's okay to say, I'm a mess. And we're not providing that for people, and so they're just looking for it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that if we kind of capture that better relationship with one another, or even, because I want to even apply that to kind of how we go about global mission, right? And how we go about into orphan care and development spaces. Do you think that if we could kind of take this opportunity to develop those better relationships, that would have an impact? Because, we all saw the Barna studies, the $2.5 billion annually going into orphanages, and, God bless all those people with their amazing intentions. We all, they're a part of this community, right? So we're not ousting anybody, but we also recognize, similar to what we've already been discussing, families are the best asset. Families are the best places for kids to be going into. Brian, do you think that if we could start to actually relate with one another in a better way, that would have the impact that we want to see in terms of global missions?
It depends. So a bunch of people hanging out together doesn't necessarily point us in the right direction. So again, I think people are hardwired for 4 key relationships: God, self, others, and creation. And we have to understand biblically what the nature of those relationships are supposed to be. And so in terms of relationship with others, it's supposed to be that I'm here to serve you. Mm-hmm. And you're here to serve me. It's just not about me. There's a marvelous book that's come out called Selfie Missions, which gets what I'm talking about far deeper. And somehow missions became all about us. So we need a community that says it's about dying to yourself and living for the other. And once people are discipled into that, and that becomes part of our DNA, then suddenly the missions experience doesn't need to be about a 1 week great experience for me to feel better about myself. We can start to ask questions about, how do I really be part of God's mission around the world? What does that mission look like in low-income communities? What does his healing and his restoration mean in this community? And so suddenly the questions start to become different. And we start to say, how could I love this child? How could I love the family they're part of? And so it's a discipleship problem. And if we were doing a better job of discipleship on this end, I think a lot of the dynamics that we're falling into internationally would start to ameliorate.
Yeah, there's so much goodness there. And it actually, all this conversation, I think we overcomplicate things so much in our worlds. We try to do things. We try to do it. I just had a conversation with a guy the other day, and he's a college student. I did some training there with them on personality styles and things like that. And he said to me, I'm just so caught up in success. And I said, what does that even mean? And he's like, I'm trying to do. And I go, yeah, and you need to be.
That's it.
And
I'm the worst at this. Look,
right.
I'm an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And so I have this need, this drive to create and to produce. And some of that is God-given, and some of it's just idolatry. And so it's really hard to get it right.
100%. And I cited to him I do another podcast called How Soccer Explains Leadership, and I've been able to interview some amazing people. And one of the guys, his name's Grant Daniels, and he talked about achieved identity versus received identity. And what he said was one of the most beautiful things. He said, when you play, it was in the context of soccer, but when you do anything with an achieved identity, you play scared to survive. But when you play within a received identity, you play safe to serve.
And
I thought it was so brilliant and beautiful. And he says, because the reality is everyone will meet their match. Everyone will not get what they want. Everyone will. But when you play safe to serve, you can just be. You can just receive what God gives to you, and everything flows out from there. And it's so freeing. It's so beautiful. And it's a huge responsibility at the same time that we have to steward that received identity in a way that loves others and serves others and does for others what, as you said, that's why I love full circle back to what is God's theory of change and how can we live into that? And that's where I just get so excited to hear what you're talking about, and also to talk about what does collaboration look like in the midst of that. We always hear, if we don't care who gets the credit, we can do amazing things. But as you said, Brian, we're better coaches than players in that regard most of the time, right? And also, we forget, we don't listen to ourselves as well when we talk about most of the good things in life, if not all, come on just the other side of comfortable. You going to that thing this afternoon, great things are going to happen out of that. You know that.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, it's not comfortable.
That's it.
And for people-focused people, listening and empathy is not comfortable. But when we do that, amazing things happen. Anyway, on that note,
Phil,
I want to hear from you.
You're smart for the dumb guy on this podcast.
I don't know. I just talk. I talk, and if you throw enough stuff against the wall, something will stick, But I love hearing...
The achieved versus received thing is everything.
It's exactly
everything.
Yeah.
And
aside to that, go ahead. Sorry.
I tend towards the achievement end. I don't mean to, but it's the habit. So you're totally onto it.
Most of us do, right? Most of us, talent relationship flows into identity. And that's what creates our identity.
That's right.
And that, it has to be reversed. It's an upside down kingdom, right? So you said flip the triangle. And so we'll cite to that on the show notes. Put those in the show notes, Brandon. That episode. It's Graham Daniels. It's like probably a few weeks ago in How Soccer Explains Leadership. All right, so all of that really comes together and brings us to this idea of collaboration, which again is a huge component of this podcast. Something we've talked about from episode 1. It's really why we did the podcast, is to facilitate collaboration, help people work together better. And, you guys are doing that together in cool ways. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we get to that, Brian, with Chalmers, a lot of stuff you guys have done is with the local church, addressing poverty in the communities. So I'd love to hear, a couple lessons you learned from that space, but also how similar it is, and if there's any differences really working with faith-based organizations like ACE, how you and Chalmers do that.
Key lessons from working with the local church is that there's a supernatural thing going on there. I think the Bible teaches that Christ dwells in the local church, and so that means when we're with a church in a village in rural Africa that looks like it's got nothing, well, what does it have? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords dwelling amongst them. And so once we get beyond just looking at the material, we start to look at the spiritual realm, at the relational dimension of things as well. You start to realize that the same power that raised Christ from the dead is at work in the people in that church. Ephesians 1 teaches us that. That's a lot of power. And so it's just recognizing what's really there. What's really there is God Almighty dwelling amongst people. And that there's an incredible power there that we should recognize, that we should honor, that we should seek to strengthen and to mobilize. And so for me, that's the biggest thing, that's the greatest asset on earth is the local church, in my view. We do work with quite a few parachurch organizations, large international NGOs, Christian relief and development agencies, and so on. We have very much enjoyed working with ACE, and that's quite frankly, I've not been that involved in the details of that. Russ Mask on my staff has been the primary person there, but I think what I've appreciated about Gabe is his posture. It's always about how can we link arms to move the ball forward, and he's very careful about wanting to honor Chalmers and everything, and wanting to make sure that we're okay with things. He's just very good at relationship, way better than I am. And so he's very good at just honoring the other and making sure the other can be what the other is created to be. And so that's the key. Yeah.
Now that you've been teed up, I just love to hear from you about the partnership, about the collaborative work you've been doing with Chalmers in Zambia with Family Preservation Empowerment Program. And how did that collaboration come to be, and how have you nurtured it? Love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, so I had read When Helping Hurts, quite a few years ago, and I was actually at, I think, a CAFO conference. I believe it was CAFO conference, not World Without Orphans, but I saw Brian speak, and I heard a little bit more about the savings groups and the theory of change that they had. And this was right when I had started at ACE. And like I said before, a little bit earlier, we had primarily been doing emergency food relief as well as savings groups. And we had this dependency problem, like I said. And so I had also, as Brian alluded to, thought about working at the Chalmers Center and had a little bit of a relationship with those guys as a result. And so when I started working at ACE and I saw just the incredible theory of change that the Chalmers Center had, and just the idea that we really needed to move away from dependency. So like I said, we had some of these individual families that had been on our program for 8 to 10 years. So way longer than they needed to be, way longer than what was, good for the program or good for ACE. And so for us, we really wanted to start with just, hey, what makes sense? Like I said, how can we honor Chalmers, and how can ACE also benefit from a relationship if we can collaborate together? And so it came pretty clear pretty early on, again, through Russell Mask primarily, that we really needed to move away from a dependency model to an empowerment model, and ultimately to the graduation approach, or it's for short, they call it the GA. So Russell Mask and several of his colleagues, they spent, I would say honestly, close to an entire year sensitizing our local team. So not me so much as the ACE Zambia local team on what the GA was. And again, I would say, and Brian will appreciate this comment, I want to caution those that are thinking about using the GA. It is complex. It also is it needs to be contextualized very particularly to work well. But for us, since we had been around for quite a long time and we had, enough local team, like 75 staff, we had the capacity that we needed to actually try to take it on. And we couldn't do that alone, to be honest. Like, we had tried different things. All of them had been leading to dependency. And it wasn't until, and that was really, I think, the God glorifying aspect of our collaboration, is it took, in some cases, Russell Mask, who had been a researcher and had implemented some, but needed someone to actually implement, right? And then us, who were implementing, but needed that technical expertise. It took that coupling of those two skills and two kind of areas of expertise to have an end product that I think was really glorifying to God and really glorifying to the individuals that we were working with. So what we started with was, again, another caution. We didn't just go full bore into the GA. We started with a really small cohort, a couple hundred families. These are families that we knew to some extent. And again, we partnered with the Zambian government. That's really important too, is when you can actually partner with the local experts. You don't want to do things, and a lot of organizations make the mistake of just going and doing things without the government even being aware of what they're doing, let alone being aware of what the regulations or the policies are that the government has in place. And so we used basically a targeting mechanism that the government had, and we targeted the ultra materially poor. Again, I use that term materially poor, not poor in general, families in Lusaka, Zambia, and we enrolled them into a 24-month cycle of the GA. I think what's also really important, and the Chalmers Center helped us a lot with, was it's not enough simply to do the GA. You really need to also do the M&E, or the monitoring and evaluation, right? And so it's great to do an intervention. It's even better to see how it actually works, right? And so for us, even though it's been about a year since that 24 months has lapsed, we're still doing post-intervention checkups with all of those families to make sure that they're still sustainably out of poverty. And again, I think another God-glorifying thing is in my conversations with Brian and with Russell, that also influenced our idea for this next cohort of the GA, introducing the spiritual discipleship element as an overlay to the GA. And again, that was something that comes out of collaboration and conversation, right? It doesn't just come out of me thinking of that. That would never happen. I'm not able to do that. And so I think for us, we really, again, emphasize how do we do the GA, but again, how do we get to the core of the trauma and some of the spiritual poverty that these women in particular have experienced. But going back to the collaboration, again, I think the core thing is that ACE could not have done it on our own. And I think, Chalmers didn't have the implementation in Zambia to be able to do it by themselves. And so we were able to do something where we were able to come open hands and humbly. And again, I think another thing to emphasize would be, not every collaboration is going to work. You have to have wisdom, right? You have to know who you should collaborate with and maybe when and where that makes sense. And so for us, it took probably 18 months of just getting to know each other and praying with each other and thinking about, what that could look like. And I think that sometimes people make the mistake of jumping into collaboration too quickly as well. And I think for Brian and I, it took a long time just to know how our organizations could overlap in a God-glorifying way.
I love hearing that 18 months. We're so quick to, as you talked about it, Brian, we're achievement, we're results, transactional, and especially here in the US, it's like, let's get it done. And you know what? It's sometimes painstaking. And to your point, I love that, Gabriel. Talking about that, I think if there's one thing being a lawyer taught me, doing it for 8 years, whatever, was, find the right person to do what you need done. Don't try to figure it out yourself, and don't just go get someone. Get the right person, the right people. And then it's amazing. It's incredible when you get those right people who complement you. As you said, you can't do it. We learn to celebrate the differences. We learn to celebrate these other people who do things way better than we do in these different areas. And then amazing things can happen. If we try to just rush it in any of those areas, if we try to rush the person, if we try to rush the relationship, you can't do this stuff without just utmost trust and respect in each other. So love that. Love hearing that story. Folks out there, listen to that. Go listen back. Just listen to those different steps. There's so much more to it as well. So I encourage you to reach out to these guys and learn more about that. If that's something that's just completely foreign to you, like what? That 18 months? No, I'd lose all my donors. No, you won't. You just need to help them understand that the best things come when these things are done in ways that are synergistic rather than 1 + 1 = 2, right? It should be 1 + 1 + 1 = who knows what that number can be, right? So anyway, we're going to wrap it up. We got our questions that we ask everybody. We're going to do this a little differently because Brian has been on before, but also because we have two of you, and it could take a long time if we do this how we normally do. But what we're going to do is quick. No commentary. No like, hey, this is the best book I've ever read, and here's all this. I want to hear from you, because I do want to hear what you guys say to this. And Brian, it's been so long that I know you've read or listened or watched to something more recently. But what have you read, watched, or listened to that has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children and families with excellence? So let's start with you, Gabe.
Yeah, so actually I just went back and reread a lot of the Faith to Action manuals. And so just going through all of those, and also the archive that Better Care Network has, and the research that's come out of so many different areas, those two sources in particular have been incredibly impactful for me.
I know less about the technical dimensions of orphan care than anybody else on this call. but I'm increasingly finding myself just reading more and more in the space of what is a human being? what does human flourishing look like? What does that look like? Because it turns out that just shows up everywhere, in all of our work, including in this space. And so certainly Bryant Meyer's Walking with the Poor continues to have an impact on my life. Leslie Newbegin, The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, continues to shape me. I've read some Trinitarian theologians, including my co-author, Kelly Kapic. So I find myself reading more and more in the space of just theological anthropology. It sounds really highfalutin, and I'm an economist. Man, I can hardly understand what I'm reading half the time. But the more I plunge, the more I immerse myself in that stuff, I find the more it's helping me to see applications in a wide range of settings.
Absolutely. I love that you said it's kind of heady and it's kind of that, because Brandon's up there cheering. If you're listening to this, Brandon's like getting super excited because this is that's like his, yeah, it's his love language. It's his love language, those heady things. So, no, all great books. I love that you're talking about that, because human flourishing, that's what it's all about. If it's not, then we're not doing it right. So, okay, last question. We'll start with Brian on this one. If it could be a similar answer, I don't even remember what you said. So if it's the same answer, great. If not, great. But what person has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children and families with excellence?
I would actually say that two of my colleagues, my co-authors, Steve Corbett, my co-author on When Helping Hurts, and several other books, and then Russ Mask, we mentioned earlier, who co-authored a book with me called From Dependence to Dignity, is all about microfinance. Those two brothers, who are both nearing retirement, by the way, and so we're kind of going through that process. Those two brothers have discipled me for 25 years, and yeah, I'm just so grateful to both of them for all they've taught me.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I can't say one individual person. I would say the ACE Zambia local team, to be honest. We have a local leadership team, but even looking at some of the caregivers that we have in our crisis nurseries and just seeing that they're there every day. There's not a lot of glamour to it. It's difficult, but they're sacrificing and they're there day in and day out. I would say that's where the rubber meets the road on a lot of this. It's easy to say contextually, this and this and hypothetically, but to actually see these, individual caregivers that are sacrificing for their families to care for the most vulnerable. That's really for me where it's kind of impacted me the most. So
Awesome. Well, guys, I so respect both of you. I am so encouraged by both of you, encouraged by this collaborative. I love having this picture of what we talk about on this show that is helping lives, helping people flourish. And so absolutely love it. And I'm just grateful to call both of you guys friends. So thank you. Keep it up.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, no surprise that was just full of so much wisdom, so much good stuff. And, like I said during the interview, just the collaboration, I just get so excited about seeing it actually happen, seeing two great organizations coming together to do things they never could have done on their own. And it's awesome. Awesome. So what'd you think about it, Brandon?
Well, no, I loved it. I mean, anytime you get to talk with Brian, he's just smart as a whip, winsome, funny. Gabe just brought so much to the conversation from his own expertise. Just great conversation. I think it's one of those things, and I know this is very much in kind of the genesis and the ethos of why you started this podcast, was recognizing all these different areas that feed into orphan care, right?
Yep.
Orphan care isn't just this kind of siloed off child welfare thing. There's all sorts of things, all sorts of dynamics that kind of feed into what it means to, help a family thrive and be strong, right? So I just love this kind of archetype of, bringing together the best in orphan care as well as the best in economic development and seeing what can be created. And I feel like ACE and Chalmers really kind of kind of typified that. So yeah, a great conversation with a couple really, really great guys. So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, awesome. So, I think we talked probably enough during that interview, and it was a longer interview. I know we also could talk about Brian and Ace and Gabe and all that they're doing. But, I think because it's been quite a long show, I'm going to ask you, do you have any last parting words? And then I just have a quick recommendation. We're going to sign off. It'll be, I think, one of my favorite episodes I've done in a while. So I'm psyched on it.
Right. Well, I would just kind of say, in our last episode with Peter Greer, and then certainly now, anytime we have authors on, we always say read their books. But I think when we talk about Brian Fikkert, like, seriously, you have to read the books, right? If you haven't read When Helping Hurts, get out from your cave and go read it because it's amazing. But pick out some of his other books because they're also really fantastic. So please definitely go pick those up. But that's not the main recommendation necessarily, although it is. Oh, in a way, it is. Definitely check out the work of Brian. But I think you might have another recommendation as we kind of get to that final segment.
As they say, like, I know that Patrick Lencioni has the thing called pay to play, or play. What is it? Not pay to play. It's like basically everyone has to have certain values. If you don't have them, you can't even get on the field type thing. If you haven't read When Helping Hurts and you're listening to this podcast or you're doing this work, you need to read it. I basically say everyone who breathes should read When Helping Hurts. So it's not a recommendation like if you're doing certain things. If you're a Christian, if you're a human, 100%, it's just human flourishing. So yes, that. And I think Brian said it as well, that podcast episode, that achieved versus received identity. I've never pumped How's Augur Explains Leadership on here before, but it was so perfectly interwoven with what he was talking about. I needed to, so we'll have that in the show notes. But the other book that I read recently, I just finished it and I just flew through it. I'm going to listen to it again with my family. Is The Life We've Always Wanted, or The Life You Always Wanted. I can't remember exactly the title. But Andy Crouch's newer book, I don't know if it's his newest, but Andy Crouch, again, he's like Brian Fikkert. If he writes something, it's good. It's just like he doesn't just write stuff for money or anything. Most people don't, but he definitely doesn't. He actually said, I remember the first time I interviewed him on this show, he said, actually the only time, he said, I don't really like to write, I like to edit. But so when he writes something, it absolutely is gold. And this is no exception. It's all about human flourishing and seeing. Don't just see people, see persons. And it's the distinction. Check out the book, listen, it's everything. And so definitely, definitely recommend it. It's just so much goodness. But
Andy Crouch is a favorite, man.
Yeah.
He's an amazing speaker. I was just listening to him on podcasts the other day. It's like, listen to all my kind of subscribe to podcasts. Who am I going to look up?
Yeah.
Look up Andy Crouch, because he's just the best.
And that's what's so cool about this. I listen to it as usual. He reads it. So, and I normally listen in 1.5 to 2 times speed. I actually slowed it down because, and I was convicted by that. I was like, you know what? And he, I think, was the one who said, listen to books. If they're read by the author especially, listen to books in 1 time speed. I went to 1.2 because 1 was too slow, but it was 1.2, I think, was as typical if we're in a conversation, what it would be like. And we've had those conversations. So strongly recommend it. Listen to it. You hear intonations you wouldn't in the book. Read the book too. But with all that though, folks, as always, check out what we're recommending. This episode, man, go listen to it again and take all that you're learning from all of it and use it. Pray that you use it to help you to love orphan, vulnerable children and families with more and more excellence each and every day. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.
We hope you've enjoyed today's Think Orphan podcast. For all the information in this week's podcast, please visit us at thinkorphan.com. You too can be part of the conversation. Send your questions to info@thinkorphan.com or join us on the Think Orphan Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again on the next edition of Think Orphan.